Disclaimer, my school is far from perfect, but we do our best. So a little bit about me. I've been a head teacher for 12 years, a teacher for nearly 25 years. I was diagnosed with ADHD just over a year ago, but my oldest son was diagnosed when he was 9. He's now 14. My youngest son diagnosed when he was 4.5. And I've been on a horrific journey with my youngest son, and a very different journey with my oldest son. And I suppose if I have to think about what works for ADHD in schools, it's about actually making sure that there is open and transparent communication between parent and school. That doesn't mean that we always agree. It doesn't mean that we see things in the same way. But what it does mean is we have to try in schools to approach things from a position of understanding. And I think what we've tried really hard to do at my school in particular is about listening to parents and recognising some of the challenges that parents face at home. We may see a very different child in school, and that doesn't mean that the challenges that the parent are facing at home aren't real or we don't believe them, but sometimes we see a very different child in school. My oldest son, who is 14, has ADHD with absolute knobs on. I've replaced about 5 TVs as a result of it. Has never ever been in trouble at school, ever, because he has massive rejection sensitive dysphoria, and he cannot bear the thought of anybody looking at him and him being in trouble. So therefore that is enough to make him comply at school. If you saw him in my house and at home and away from there, he is an absolute nightmare. And so when I talk about that to his school, they're like, no, not Samuel, never. He would never do that. And then it makes me feel like they don't believe me. My youngest son, who has ADHD at the complete opposite end of the spectrum, has always been a nightmare at school. Changed schools twice before he went to secondary because actually, and I think, because it just didn't work. The first school he went to let him roll around on the floor and do nothing. He'd come home having ripped his T-shirts in half. His older brother would come home and say, he's so embarrassing, Mum, he's just throwing things around everywhere and screaming all day. But apparently there was nothing wrong with him. And then he moved schools at the end of year 2, went to another local school because I phoned the head teacher and basically begged them to take him because I just couldn't do anything with him. He just wouldn't go. He hated it. School hated him, I think. He told his teachers in reception to fuck off and that he fucking hated school. And that was probably his crowning moment. It never got any better from there on in. He then moved schools where they loved him dearly, but he learned absolutely nothing. Everything came about just placating him and making sure that he wasn't angry, he wasn't upset, he wasn't crying. And as a result of that, he did nothing, no work. He stroked the guinea pigs all day and had a really, really lovely time, but he learned absolutely nothing. But they were willing to work with me. They knew he needed something different to what they could give him, and they were, for the first time ever, I didn't feel like I wasn't being told I needed to go to parenting classes, or if I didn't go to work, maybe he wouldn't have all of these issues, and if I spent more time with him, he wouldn't have the behavioural problems that he did. The school actually listened to what I was saying and were willing to work with me. As a result, we did get an EHCP for him, but again, that wasn't the silver bullet. That isn't the magic answer, because then we had to find somewhere where he could actually go to school and be in an environment where he could actually learn, which then resulted in him moving school in year 5. Not easy. At the end of year 5, going into year 6, not easy for a child who has ASD and ADHD and wants to stay with their friends that they think they have, but they haven't really got any friends, but they haven't really worked out that they haven't really got any friends. And he moved schools and now is at a wonderful school and is doing really, really well. But that journey sent me mental. So for all you parents out there, I fully appreciate how difficult it is to navigate the education system. And I think what I want to say is either your school is your saviour or it's your worst enemy. And I've seen both sides of the coin. I've seen, as a parent, I've seen both sides. I've seen actually where it can absolutely save you, but also it can absolutely break you. And I suppose what I want to talk about tonight is how you can work with your school to try and make things better, but also about actually things that raising awareness of some of the things that actually your school can be doing and should be doing to support your children. Getting an EHCP isn't the magic answer for lots of children, and there are lots of things that schools should be doing to support your child in something that is called ordinary available provision or reasonable adjustments. One of the things that we do really well at the school that I'm at is we look at our children and we treat them as individuals. We treat them with lots and lots of love, and we are willing to flex. We're willing to flex to work out what each individual child needs. That doesn't mean we get it right all the time, and far from it. Sometimes we make really, really big mistakes, but then we own up to them and we try and work with our parents. And sometimes we have to share with our parents messages that they don't want to hear. Or that they don't recognise. And I think we've learned over the years that actually the child who's a bit bouncy in reception, who we go, oh, is going to grow out of it when they're throwing the toys around or they don't want to share or they never sit still, actually still can't sit still in year 2. And now can't sit and focus on their work either, and is now disrupting other people. And we now take a more proactive approach in having those conversations with parents much earlier on, and saying and asking the questions about how are they at home? Actually, what are they like when friends come to play? Do they suffer from high levels of anxiety? Do they get really, really worried about things? Are they constantly on the move? And we try and gather as much information as possible, as early as possible. We also say to parents, we're really proactive about doing referrals now, because ultimately you refer a child into CAMS, they'll throw it back to you and they won't accept it. Or it will take 2 years before anybody's willing to see them. So actually, we are now saying to parents of children in reception and year 1, actually, we need to get this going. It might come to nothing in the end, but actually it's better to have it and not need it than to ignore it and wait, and bearing in mind that if we wait and see if they might grow out of it, we then might refer them, and then they've still got to wait 2 years, and then we're in Key Stage 2, and then secondary is looming over the horizon, and everybody becomes terrified when their child needs to go to secondary, because they're nice, cosy primary school that's got to know them, got to know their quirks, and got to flex for them, and they're going to go into a secondary school where they're probably going to encounter between 10 to 15 different adults a day who cannot know them in the same way as we do in primary school. That has its pros and cons. Sometimes parents are grateful. Sometimes they don't take very kindly to me suggesting or the teachers suggesting that we might need to be looking at other avenues, and are in denial. And we have to recognise that sometimes in schools that parents are going through a grieving process, and we have to support them with that journey, because it is a grieving process. When you find out that your child may have any form of additional needs, it's not how you thought it was going to play out. And that is a big barrier for schools, is that sometimes parents want to put their head in the sand, and it's actually how do we support them in a loving way to make them realise that actually all we want is the best for their child, and actually that actually we'll help them, we'll walk with them, and we'll hold their hand. Like I say, it's not always perfect. We support parents at Kings Hill. We don't apply for an EHCP for every child who's got ADHD or ASD. We do look at it on a case-by-case basis, but equally, if a parent wants to apply, we won't stand in their way. We will actively support that parent in doing so. And I suppose any of you who've got children in Berks who are going through that process now, there has been a significant change in the last 6 months. It's not perfect. There's a long way to go, but decisions about needs assessments, schools are now invited to be part of that decision-making process, which we weren't before, which has seen real positive results, actually, from what I'm seeing, because the people who are now making decisions have to listen to the school. So we go for every child who's put forward, whether it's for a child who we've applied for or a child who a parent has applied for. And what that means is we can fight the corner. We've also seen an interesting trend that whilst they're not awarding EHCPs for children in year 6, they are awarding high needs block funding, which is additional money to see them through the transition. So what they're saying is now, and I've had 5 of these granted for children, for ADHD children, since September, whose parents are really worried about the transition to secondary school and how that's going to play out, wanted EHCPs, and we said, well, we don't think you're going to get one, but we'll help you and we'll support you. Went to the meetings, and what the local authority have now agreed to is 12 months worth of funding for that child to see them through the transition and to see them through the first 2 terms into secondary, with the view that it would then be reviewed again at the end of those 2 terms. If the child still needs considerable amounts of support, you've now got the evidence to go forward for the EHCP, or actually it might have gone all right. And one of the biggest, and that's not perfect, but it's a massive step forward from where we are. So I suppose if you've got children who are reaching that transition point and you are worried about that transition, don't be afraid to go to your school and ask them, or write your own letter. There are lots of model letters out there. It doesn't have to be a really long, complicated document that you send when you apply for a needs assessment. It's a really simple letter stating that you believe your child has special educational needs and you believe that they may require additional support, because the legal threshold is a lot lower than anybody would have you believe. You don't need 3 terms of assess, plan, do, review and SEN support plans. What you need to be able to prove is the child may have special educational needs and they may require additional support, which if your child has a diagnosis of ADHD, they do have special educational needs and they may well require additional support. So don't be put off by that. When you're working with the school, I know it's really hard as a parent when things aren't going great for your child, and it becomes a very, very emotive subject. It can become, as a parent, an all-consuming subject for you, and you can feel a little bit like the world's against you. When you go and meet your school, they may not be perfect and they may not be doing, and I'm not here because actually I go into a variety of schools and some of the practice I see is absolutely amazing. And some of the practice I see, I think, thank God my child doesn't go to this school. And so there is a huge level of variability with what we get in schools. But actually, if you go in and you're shouting the odds at your teacher or at your Senko, or even if you are frustrated, not necessarily with them, but with the whole system, they're really under a lot of pressure. And I'm not excusing it because they don't always get things right. But just try and take that breath and be really, really measured. They will want to help you, and it may not always come across that way. But, I can tell you now, everybody who applied to be a Senko did it because they wanted to make a difference to children. They want to champion the needs of those children. They didn't do it because they thought, actually, I've got nothing else better to do with my time. And unfortunately, the framework and the system in which they have to work in is really, really hard to navigate. They get battered from both sides. They get battered from parents who are frustrated because they can see their child needing more than what they're getting. They get battered from the local authority who say, we're not giving you anything, we've got no money, you're not having it, we're not going to send the EP because we don't have any, we're going to issue a plan that's not fit for purpose because we can't get a speech and language therapist to come and assess your child or an OT. And they then write a plan which the Senko then, more often than not, will end up redrafting to make it fit for purpose. So just sometimes take a breath and be kind to them because they are trying their best. I think the other thing to think about is if your school is resistant to you applying for an EHCP, in the current financial climate, there is a deficit of around £10,000 for every EHCP that is awarded. The school has to put the first £6,500 in, which is part of the notional funding for every child who has one. The local authority then issues a plan that will have hours on it if you're in bucks. So it'll either say 25, 30 or 32 and a half hours. The reality is that's a lump of money that comes to the school, which is about £8,000 to £10,000. So the total funding for that EHCP is about 16 and a half, maybe £18,000. Now, I know our LSAs don't get paid a lot of money, but believe me, it costs a lot more than £16,500 to fund an LSA for 30 hours a week. And this is something that schools are challenging with the local authority all of the time. But if, like in my school, this time last year I had 8 EHCPs. I've now got 16. I'm going to have 20 before the end of the year. That's £150,000 extra I've got to find from nowhere. Now, that doesn't mean that actually those children won't get that support. They absolutely will, but it means that we have to work creatively to make it work for the child. So, for example, I don't have an LSA with every child, but in some year groups I employ an extra teacher who works in the mornings, and we clump the funding together because actually we believe that that's a better way of supporting that child. So it's, actually, if your child has an EHCP and you're expecting an adult there one-to-one all the time, go and talk to the school about what support they are providing and how best your child can be supported, because the reality is, in some of my year groups, I've got 6 EHCPs. I can't have 6 additional adults alongside the class teacher in there. It's not good for anybody. It's not good for the children, but also they wouldn't all fit. And nobody would know what they were doing. The poor teacher would spend more time trying to direct the adult than they would trying to actually support and teach the children. So, actually talk to your school. Talk to your school about what's really important in your child's plan, which are the bits that you actually are vital to your child making progress. And work with the school to go back to the local authority to challenge and say, well, actually, it's more important actually that they have support in English and maths. Or actually, we don't want them going out to have interventions in the afternoons because they're great at DT, or they're great at art, or they're great at music. And for some children, intervention becomes a lifestyle choice. It means that they actually never get to do any of the things that they're actually good at. And that's really, really sad. If you're sitting there in school and struggling, and you've worked all morning really, really hard on the things that you find really, really difficult, and then the DT project's happening in the afternoon, and you're thinking, great, I can't wait to get stuck into that, and now you've got to go and do extra English and maths because that's when the TA is available to do your interventions. Just imagine for a child how soul-destroying that is. So actually talk to your school about the kind of support that your child needs and how you can be creative about how that support is put in place. If your school won't listen to you, find somebody who will. There will be somebody in your school, and it might not be your child's class teacher. It might be the SENCO. Don't be afraid to go and ask to speak to somebody different. I think one of the biggest challenges in primary school sometimes is for children, if they get on with their teacher, it's great. And if their teacher's interested in them. But in primary school, you're stuck with the same person all day, every day, probably sat in the same seat, looking out the same window, especially if you've got ADHD. And that's really hard to be sat there all day, every day, listening to the same voice. And I do think that when children transfer to secondary school, that is one thing that can be a little bit easier for them, is that after an hour they get a natural movement break. And if you like your teacher, it's great. But if you don't, and believe me, sometimes children don't like their teacher for whatever reason. It could be that they didn't say good morning to them and they're going to hold it against them for the rest of the year. It could be that they told them off for something that they thought was unfair and they won't let it go. It could be that they expect a lot of them and they don't want to work that hard. There are many, many reasons why children and teachers don't always get along. And so as a parent, if you don't feel like your teacher is listening or is understanding your child, don't be afraid to ask to speak to somebody else, because you will find somebody in your school who does love your child. And it's whether it's because they recognise themselves in them and going, yeah, I was like that as well, or just because they've spent more time with them. I spoke to a parent last week who was quite upset that their class teacher had said to them their child was really annoying. And when I sat the parent down and said, yeah, but they called out every answer before the teacher had finished speaking. They interrupted 20 times during the lesson. And I understand that you don't want to realise that your child has ADHD, but I'm telling you, they do. And I understand for your child that it's really, really, really miserable that their teacher keeps telling them to be quiet, but we've got to find a way to help them not shout out that answer 20 times, not call out, not get out of their seat, not jump up and down when they know the answer to the question, because it's great that they do, but there are 29 other children in the class. So yes, the teacher might have been a little bit irritated, and yes, your child may be a bit upset, but we need to find a way that they can manage the fact that they're really great at this, and that the teacher can recognise that as well and not squash them down and berate them all the time, because actually the teacher having to tell them to be quiet isn't great for their self-esteem. And that's when actually things start to escalate, is when the children feel like somebody's constantly nagging at them, somebody's constantly on at them all of the time, because then they become fed up, disaffected, don't feel like they can do anything right, and then they start misbehaving. Because why would they bother? Why would they bother? Because I sit here, I do the right thing, I know the answer, I'm offering the answer, and I'm still getting into trouble. And it's actually finding ways to be the bridge to actually, and that's where my role as head teacher quite often act as the bridge, because the parent comes to me because they're upset, and the teacher comes to me because they're upset, and then we sit there and we mediate and we go, okay, so how do we find a way for the child forward? Because there is always a way. Other things that when you go and talk to your school about wanting help, they may suggest to you, and sometimes parents take umbrage at this, but what you need to remember is we're trying to leverage our way through the system for you too. So if you go and say they're an absolute nightmare at home, I'm really, really struggling, I'm worried that they might have ADHD, ASD, school says, yep, we're really concerned too, we're going to do a referral to CAMS. School might also follow that up with, we'd also like to refer you to the family support service, of which parents go, you're referring me to social care, you think I'm a crap parent. No, we don't. But if we refer you to social care, it's more likely CAMS are going to take it through. Social care are going to look at it and go, well, what can we do? And so, but it doesn't mean that they think that you're rubbish. It's about trying to push things through the system. Because actually we have to realise that we're working with a system where everyone wants to say no. The answer is always driven by, we've not got enough money, we've not got enough bodies, we've not got enough people. And so therefore, with the school together, we need to find enough reasons to make sure that the people can't say no. The other thing I've used as a head teacher before, and not at my own school, but one of the other schools I'm working at and one I'm using at the moment, is nobody at the local authority is listening to us. Not listening to me, not listening to the parent, not listening to the fact that we're all crying out for support and we've got children in crisis. So therefore, actually, we've got children who are in crisis. You know, I was punched, had my hair pulled out, was spat at by a child. It's not the child's fault. The child has ADHD. Mum's trying to get a med review, child has an EHCP, we are not the right setting for them. Mum recognises that, we recognise that, everyone recognises that. But actually finding the right place for them is really, really difficult. And therefore it's, what do we do to then make people listen? We then start looking at using things such as suspensions, not because we don't want the child, but working with the parent to say, actually, we need people to listen to us because they don't want to listen to us. And if we're not complaining and shouting and making a noise about it, they'll just let the children just bob through the system, because the special school system, the ARCs, the APs, the PRUs, they're all full too. And actually, for me, my view is I have to champion each one of my children like they're my own. So working with the parent to say we need to get the best possible outcome. And sometimes we have to use things that actually we don't want to use to make people listen and to shout. We have to do the shouting for the parents sometimes, and we definitely have to do the shouting for the child, because the child can't shout for themselves.